All right, guys. So what you see here is again my PyCharm, and I made the connection to this database. And right now I can actually interact with the database using PyCharm. So PyCharm is really for Python, but it also, the professional has more kind of, you can think of them as plugins or kind of uh, plugins is a good, way to describe those. And those plugins allow you to do things like connect to a database and interact with the database. Sweat, you have a question? So Sweat is saying, I don't have a folder under my Postgres. Yeah, so again, in that case, you want to click here and you want to find your database. Actually, you don't see my screen, do you? Okay, so if you click here and you can find your database and you just kind of check that box. So mine is DJ8 or D8J. And I just kind of, I just clicked that checkbox. Another option would be to kind of open it and just click on publics or public. Is that good, guys? Okay. Sweat, you have another question, or are you good? Sometimes you have to wait. You might want to refresh it, but it should appear. Something should appear here, and you can click here, and you can find the database. So it's fine. If you're still having issues, we can try to address them maybe during the break or after class. But yeah, so Austin is saying maybe it didn't connect correctly. That's possible. Again, you don't have to follow along. I mean, it's good if you do, but if they're having so many kind of issues, we can do things offline. Okay, guys. So what you see here, I'm going to actually do it from the beginning. If you right click here, you can go to, or rather actually not, you don't have to right click. You can click here on this query console, jump to query console. If you do this, you can open the default console, and that'll be this one. Of course, you can open a new console, that's fine, but let's kind of stick to the default console. And here we can write code that kind of interacts with the database. So again, just like what I mentioned last week, databases, at least relational databases, they consist of tables, and those tables are kind of connected to each other. Right now we have 0 tables. So let's create kind of one simple table, and let's try to kind of see if we see it. Let's try to put some data in it, but let's create a table. Now here's the syntax, and you have to, of course, memorize that syntax. You're going to be quizzed on this next week. It looks like this: create, and we say table, and then we give the table a name. So maybe we say students. Let's just do students. Now, the convention here is to use lowercase for the table. So you want to say something like students. And another convention would be to actually not use plural. You would use singular. So even though that table is going to have many students, you want to give it the name student. That's kind of how, that's the convention. And between parentheses, you want to specify the columns. So again, table is going to consist of columns. You don't really specify the data. Right now, we're just talking about the structure of the table. We're not going to put any data in the table, just we're going to create the structure. So it'll be called student. Let's say it has first name and last name. And let me do that, and then I'll have Loai ask his questions. So I'm going to say first name, maybe like that. And I'm going to say the data type of the first name is going to be char, or maybe I can do var char, and between parentheses 100. I'll tell you what that is. And then I'm going to say last name. I'll explain that in a second. And then I'm going to say var char 100. So again, the table name is student. This is the first column. This is the second column. The data type of the first column is essentially string, and it can go up to 100 characters. That's what that number is. That number tells you how many what's the max length of that field or that column. And same thing for last name. Maybe I'm going to do 100. And if I hit this play, this execute, it should create a table with the name student that has 2 columns. Let's try that. Okay, so it says there's a problem. It doesn't like something here. And I think, I use varchar here, but I think it's char. I mean, I'll tell you why I use varchar in a second. But okay, so now for char it worked. For varchar, it didn't work. I'll tell you again why I use varchar. Maybe not now. When we see varchar, we're gonna have to see varchar. So Benjamin, it worked for varchar. Yeah, I thought I had the semicolon, so I don't know what the problem was actually. I thought I had a semicolon. Anywho, so it seems that it worked for you for varchar. It worked for me for char, so that's fine. I'll tell you what the difference is again later. Loa, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, the language that you were just writing in, was that in Postgres?
Yes, so this is called SQL, and it's really the same whether you're using Postgres or MySQL or Microsoft SQL. So we have different kind of databases that are relational, that are SQL, and we're going to use, in this course, we're going to learn Postgres, which is really the most popular nowadays. So, okay, guys. So when you do this, if you kind of expand this database, and if you go to here, and if you expand public, you will see that you have a table, or rather you have a folder of tables, and then you have a student here. So this code actually created a table under your database here with the name student. Okay, so Benjamin is saying, does the table have 100 rows? This table student has 0 rows. We haven't put anything in it, but it can have millions of rows. So it can have as many rows as you want. Okay, of course, at some point it might become slow if you have kind of too many rows, but essentially you can have as many as you want. Any other questions, guys? So the console, you're referring to this one, right? So Jesse's saying, I don't see this one. That's okay. If you don't see this one, it doesn't really matter for now. This one is, for me, it kind of showed automatically, so I don't really know why it didn't show for you, but it's probably somewhere kind of here. You want to kind of click on some buttons. I don't know. I would have to kind of spend some time kind of find how you would kind of show that. But for now, if the table is being created, that's really all that matters. Okay, so Benjamin is saying, what does 100 do? Where is 100, Benjamin? Oh, this 100. Oh, okay. Sorry, I forgot that I put 100 here. Yes, this is the maximum number of characters. You're right, Benjamin. So this is the length of first name. Okay, so again, you can hit play. And right now I have a problem, of course, and that makes sense. Student already exists, so you can't recreate it. That should make sense. So if you hit play again, it says you can't create that. Okay. So Ryan is saying if you do control followed by enter, but that's the same thing as, for me, control enter actually doesn't do it. But yeah. All right. Okay, then services. Okay, that's good. I mean, that's perfect. I'm gonna use this play, the one that I'm comfortable with. Okay, guys, do you have any questions about this? All right. So now what we can do, we can double click on student, and you can see it has a table that has first name, last name, and you can put data. So to put data, you can do plus, and you can put like a first name, like, like first sample, let's say first 01, and last name, well, let's put a name, Ben. That's kind of a last name, first name, and of course, once you do that, you want to save this into the database. And for you to do that, you have to press on submit. You have to kind of click here on submit. So if you click on submit, it'll take a second. And right now it's actually saved on Heroku. So right now it's on the cloud. So if you refresh, you will see that, it's here. If you quit, if you disconnect, then connect again, it'll have this data. Okay, I'm gonna create another one. Let's say Malcolm Gladwell. I'm gonna create another one. Michael Lewis. And I'm gonna create a new one. Do you guys see what I'm doing here? I'm just like coming up with just random values here, semi-random. And I'm just putting them in those kind of rows. And I need to submit. And if you refresh, the data will be here. Is that good, guys? Do you have any questions about this?
Hey, yes. So when you click on first name and last name, what does that do?
So this one is going to order them. If you're asking about this one will actually order them by strings, which uses the ASCII code, but essentially it'll start by uppercase A to Z, then lowercase a to Z. So that's how the sorting happens for strings. So here, if you sort by first name, you can see it'll be B, then M, then S. And you can sort by last name if you want. That's perfectly fine. You can actually sort by both at some point. But here, for some reason, I don't really sort. I don't use sorting by more than one column, but you could. All right, so someone is asking, how do you save the data? You click here on this kind of arrow, this up arrow. Or Ben is saying you can do Control Enter to kind of, that's fine. Those shortcuts are good. All right, guys. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my default console. I'm going to show you how you can delete the table. So I showed you how you can create. I'm going to show you how you can delete. You do that by doing drop. So drop is a command that will actually get rid of the table. Excuse me. And all you have to do is just drop table. So I'm going to say drop table, and it's called student, and I have a semicolon. And if I execute this one, it'll actually drop the table. So now it'll delete it. It'll just get rid of it. Now, if I kind of refresh this, actually it refreshed by itself, you see that public right now has nothing. It doesn't have a table. So we talked about create table. We talked about drop table. Right now I'm going to create the table again. So I'm just to kind of practice. I'm going to say create table. I'm going to say student. And right now I want to actually have more columns. So I like this first name. Why not? So first name, I'm going to use actually varchar. Let's see this time if it will work. Oof. Wow. Varchar, and I'm going to say 100. I'm going to say last name varchar 100. Then I'm going to do age, maybe just to kind of give it some different values. And age, the data type of age, of course, shouldn't be varchar, which is a string. It should be maybe a numeric value. We can do int. Int should make sense for age, and I can do int like this. So notice here, guys, again, that I'm using uppercase for the keywords and lowercase for the kind of the names that I defined. And that's the convention. So the convention is this is a keyword, so it's all uppercase. This is the name of the table, which could be anything, so it's lowercase. Name of the column could be anything. And this is data type, which is a keyword. So I'm going to hit play. Let's see if it'll work. I think it worked. So this time it worked. This time varchar worked. I know I used lowercase the first time, but it should still work with lowercase. Anywho, I'm going to double click on student, and you will see that right now I have first name, last name, and age. So I can, of course, put values. Let me put something here. Let's see. Who do you want to put? Let's say Adam. Grant. Let's say 50. Are you good, guys? Do you have any questions? I think someone had a question, but maybe not anymore. Okay. So Blake is asking, do you have to specify a max int? You don't have to specify a max int actually, but you could. You could do that. That's just one of the options that you would do. Okay, so that's a good question. So one thing that you can do, let's say you want to copy this and paste it. You can actually copy and paste, but another kind of shortcut for copying and pasting is Command D. If you do Command D, you're essentially copying and pasting, and you can change the values. Of course, you can delete that. That's perfectly fine. And once you make a change, you can kind of submit. Now here you can see submit is disabled because I haven't made any changes. But if I kind of copy this one and submit, you can see I have two rows that are essentially identical now. All right. Do you guys have any question? I think Loy has a question. What's your question, Loy?
When you say Command D, what exactly do you type in order to do that? Or what do you press?
Yeah, for a Mac, you want to do Command D. Like you press the Command Option, then D. And for Windows, you want to do Control D. All right, guys. So this table has a problem. The problem is it doesn't have a unique column. So when we create tables, we should always create a column with the name maybe ID and make sure that this one is unique. It has to be unique. So let me do that. I'm going to go back to the console, and I'm going to first thing I'm going to drop. Well, let me do the default console. I'm going to drop. You can see I'm just doing the same things here just to kind of practice. And I'm going to execute this one. Right now, student is going to be gone. And then I'm going to create a new student, create table, student. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to create ID. So I'm going to say ID, that's going to be a column. And this one can be an int. But I want to make sure that this is unique. And the way we do that in relational databases is by saying that this is a primary key. So if you say that this is a primary key, essentially you're saying that this one is going to be unique. So the database management system, Postgres, is going to make sure that you don't kind of duplicate this value for any two rows. So I'm going to say primary. You can see that it continues for me. It's really nice, primary key. And then, of course, I can have first name, last name, whatever. I'm just going to have first name this time, just to save time. Varchar 100. I'm going to do a semicolon, and I'm going to execute this one. Okay, so it executed fine. So that should work for you too. So it created a table student. It only has two columns, ID and also first name. And ID is an integer. That's okay. But ID is a primary key also, which means that you can't have two rows that have the same ID. And this is, again, this is important. You do want to do that. So now, if we try to actually, I'm going to double click on student here. You can see we have an ID and we have a first name, and ID has this key, this kind of key picture, and that means it's a primary key. Loa, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just, I think you already answered it though with primary key, but I was just gonna ask, like, what did you mean by that? Or, like,
yeah, primary key. It means actually that you can't have duplicates in your rows. I mean, that's really what it means. It means that this is a column that I'm going to use to be able to identify kind of specific rows. And that's really that's the main thing that primary key means. Blake, you have a question? How do you submit the table? What do you mean by submitting the table? So to create the table, you have to click here, execute, when you're here and you, let's say you put something, say for example, I want to put ID 1 and I want to say bin. If you want to save the data, then you can click here on this submit. So after you hit, maybe you want to hit enter so that you can leave this edit mode, and then you can just click here and that will submit. Okay, so Carly is asking a very good question. Let's say you're designing a database and you realize that you actually need to add another column. Let's say you realize that age or date of birth is actually important to your application. Can you add a column, or do you have to drop the table with everything in it and then recreate the table? The answer is you can add a column. You can add, there is syntax to add a column. We can do that now or maybe in a little bit. I mean, it's not the most important syntax. So creating the table, dropping the table, and inserting into the table using SQL, and even retrieving using SQL, those are kind of the main kind of commands. And then we can talk about adding columns, dropping columns, even changing data types of columns. So you can really do all of that. And we'll have time to talk about all of that. Maybe not everything today, but in this course. Okay, guys, I want to show you that you cannot have duplicates. So if you do plus here or control D, it doesn't really matter. And if you try to do 1, and if you say, for example, John, it'll kind of be okay. But as soon as you try to submit it, it'll tell you, wait a second, duplicate key value violates unique constraint. So you can't do that. So I have to change this one to 2 or 5 or 10 or 200. Doesn't really matter. As long as it's unique, Postgres is going to be happy. All right, Jesse, you have a question?
What happens if the ID is left null?
Yeah, so that's a good question. What if you create a new row and you keep this null and you say Steve, for example? It shouldn't allow you by default. And now you might be able to kind of specify that I'm okay with it. But by default, I think primary key should not allow null. Let's try. You can see by default, it's actually not null constraint. You can change that, but by default, you can't, which actually you shouldn't change. I mean, if it's a primary key, you should always have an ID. You should never kind of have a row that doesn't have an ID. So even though you could kind of allow it, you don't really want to do that. All right, Loa, you have a question?
When you were saying in Postgres that you cannot have duplicates, did you just mean if you use the primary key command, or do you mean like generally in Postgres you cannot have duplicates?
So when you define your table like this, when you say that this one is a primary key, essentially you're telling Postgres to create a table that does not allow duplicates. So this is where you actually tell it that you can't allow duplicates. If you try to put duplicates, like if you try to put 200, it'll allow you here. But as soon as you try to push your changes to Postgres, because again, the database is a Postgres database. And if you try to kind of do that, Postgres is not going to allow it. It's going to say, wait a second, when you created that table, you told me that it's a primary key, and primary key can't have duplicates. Because of that, I'm not going to allow you. And that's really what happens.
So I do get that part, but I was saying, like, if you did not have like the primary key label, would you be able to have duplicates or no?
Yes. So if you don't have the primary key, it's not going to know that this is an ID and this has to be kind of treated in a unique way. No, for it, ID is like age, is like anything else. And if you don't specify that it has to be a primary key, it can have duplicates. Yes. All right. Okay. That's good. So someone, Dananji, is saying, how do we drop a row? Okay, guys. So let us kind of try to agree on a few things. I'm going to, of course, let me kind of change that to 210. Let's agree on a few things once I kind of submit. The term drop, we don't actually use it for rows. if you want to get rid of rows, we use delete. There's a distinction between changing the data and changing the structure of the table. When you delete rows, you're not changing the structure, you're changing the data. And we don't use drop for that, we use delete. But if you want to remove a column, that's going to actually change the structure of the table, and we use the term drop. So when you see drop table, we use drop because we're going to change the structure. We're going to get rid of the entire table. And if you want to, of course, get rid of a column, we're going to say drop column. So to go back to Dhananjay's question, how do we delete a particular row? You can just simply highlight it and press delete like this, and then submit. Is that good, guys? So let's see, we're going to have a quiz every single week unless we have an exam. So the answer is yes, we have a quiz next week on this beginning of class. That's, if you go to the website, you will see that we have a quiz on every Wednesday except when we have exams. Unless, of course, Wednesday is holiday. Is it? I don't think so. I don't think it's holiday. So we're going to have a class, so we're going to have a quiz. Jesse, you have a question, or did you forget to lower your hand? Okay, all right. Okay, guys, do you have any questions about any of that? So we talked about creating a table, dropping a table. We talked about primary key. We talked about integers and varchar and char. Again, now we don't need to worry about the difference. And I want to talk about something else, but do you guys want to take a break now before we do? I think we did say that we should take a break 12:30, kind of roughly. So let's take a break now for 15 minutes.